Hello, listeners. Welcome back to another episode of Cognitive Dissidents. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Rob and I were back at it for our weekly chat, and about halfway into the podcast, because of a miscommunication with my wife, I had to go grab my daughter Annie, who had woken up from a nap, and I was technically on duty to make sure that she was okay. So for the second half of this podcast, it was a podcast in arms. I had Annie literally in my arms. We're planning on actually doing the video for all these podcasts on YouTube going forward, but we obviously won't put out the video for this particular one. But I can tell you the video of me trying to entertain Annie while listening to Rob while formulate takes is video. Maybe I'll share at her wedding on a screen somewhere or something like that. But in any case, you probably won't notice that much of it because I'm sure our producer will kind of work through it, but that's why it's a little shorter than normal. And if I sounded a little scatterbrained in the second half of the podcast, and if you hear any little blips or cute shrieks from my daughter, that's what's going on there. So other than that, my email address is jacob@cognitive.investments. Email me if you want to talk about geopolitics or anything we do at CI. I think otherwise that's it. Cheers, and see you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right. When Rob and I were planning the content for this week's podcast, Rob described this week as a random grab bag of shit. And I'm pretty sure that Jacob's not going to let me title the podcast that, but it's going to be the theme of this podcast episode. We're just going around the world and talking about lots of little things. So, Rob, what's up, man? How's it going?
It's funny because we just spent like the last 3 hours talking to each other. So now we have to pretend like we're just seeing each other. Hey, Jacob, great to see you again.
Well, we were talking about boring stuff, though. This is the actual stuff that we're supposed to be talking about. Look, let's dive right in. I think we should probably start. It's been a little while since we started with China. So why don't we start with China? Because there's been some interesting things in China this week. The first is we should probably just point out that it looks like Chinese housing prices went up a little bit last month. I think, what was it, 0.2%?
0.2%.
So, I mean, that's not going to maybe blow anybody's skirt up that much, but, that's better than property prices declining. I was also kind of encouraged that it wasn't just first tier cities. It looks like that in a bunch of middle tier cities too. You also had a little bit of an increase in home prices. There was a really interesting, China unveiled its number one central document for 2023 with a big focus on agriculture. And then you looked at the ASML story a little bit closer than I did, Rob. I believe it was that ASML said one of its Chinese employees, or a former employee that was based in China, had stolen intellectual property. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So there was a disclosure that they had to make in their annual report, it looks like, and they pointed out that a China-based employee had stolen intellectual property, and they had since subsequently been fired. And I think they had to disclose it because it violated some export restrictions. So not a huge deal as far as we can tell, but just getting to what we were discussing last week about how hard it is, even for a very special case like ASML, just in general, to keep things under wraps. Here we go a week later and you have a piece of news like this. So not encouraging if you want to keep China in the dark forever.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Rob, I don't mind when there are French people talking in the background, but tell whoever is sneezing and coughing they need to take antihistamine or something like that.
Oh my God.
That sounds terrible.
If they're not yelling, it's some kind of function. That's some bodily function that's going on.
Literally a grab bag. Oh, all right. So let's not go down that route. But no, I was actually talking to a friend who focuses on this stuff a little bit and said that the Dutch government's reticence to kind of be public about joining on to U.S. semiconductor restrictions shouldn't necessarily be read as the Dutch government wanting to be soft on China, but rather the opposite, that it should be read as the Dutch government wanting to be harsher on China in terms of restrictions. And maybe this story has something to do with it. ASML said it wasn't material, but I think you're right. They're trying very hard to telegraph that they don't want to be subject to any U.S. sanctions going forward, which is a pretty interesting thing. Do you have thoughts about the housing prices? Is that enough for you? Do you think maybe China's off the treadmill, it's not off the treadmill, obviously, but we've talked about China being on the treadmill to hell. Is it catching up to the treadmill? Is it not in danger of falling flat off its face like in a meme or something like that? Or do you think this is way too early to be saying anything for certain about housing prices?
No, it's way too early. I mean, they're still 100% on the treadmill. But I do think it's worth talking a little bit because it actually has some read across for the U.S. housing markets, which everyone's focused on right now for obvious reasons. Because you have to look at transaction volumes and price. So in China, transaction volumes have really dropped a lot. So the last number that I saw, I didn't see the January number, but the December number, transaction volumes were still down, I think it was 24% year over year. Prices weren't as bad. Prices were flat month over month in December, and they rose 0.2%, as you mentioned, in January. But if a market is being propped up on price because transactions aren't happening, then that is not a full reflection of the health of the market, if you know what I mean. So in the US, for instance, prices have been not so bad, but transaction volumes have also been very bad.
Yeah,
there's a balance there.
There was another interesting thing that was kind of buried in Bill Bishop's cynicism newsletter this week. It wasn't even in his top 8. It was very far down. And it talked about how China's Ministry of Housing and Urban Rural Development, basically they started this pilot program in which homes have to be sold as completed units rather than as part of a pre-sold scheme, which, the pre-sold scheme is really, that's the sound of the treadmill sort of whirring, right? If you can get off of the pre-sold scheme and just sold as completed units, you get something approaching a more normal market. Maybe that's good. And the data from this ministry said that the share of sold completed units out of all the newly built units that were sold increased from 9.5% in 2021 to roughly 14% at the end of 2022. And I guess you can look at that two ways. Number one, okay, you went from 9.5% to 14%. Like something's definitely happening there. The flip side is, okay, so you went from 90% in the pre-sold scheme to 85% in the pre-sold scheme. So I guess it really is just a test of endurance. How long can China run on the treadmill? But I'm still inclined to say they're going to be able to run longer than anybody thinks. They've weathered the COVID-19 storm better than anybody thought. They haven't really blinked at the real estate crisis yet. They're doing what they have to do to get through the crisis. That sort of seems to me to be the theme of China right now. They're doing what they have to do to muscle through. And maybe it's not going to be 8% growth in perpetuity going forward, but it also, I don't know, I just don't see that it's going to be some epic collapse like people seem to be expecting.
No, I agree. I guess a few things there. The pre-sold aspect of things is a little bit tricky because what you're really describing is a form of financing. So it's very common, like if you are a developer, before you commit to doing a project, that you're going to get it pre-financed by your customers because it de-risks the project rather than building something on spec and then having to find the buyer, like once you've put up the capital yourself to build the thing. So I don't think that itself is so nefarious, just the fact that they were doing that. That's just a form of capital for these developers. Just like bonds, if they were raising money from outside investors. So I don't think that's something to really focus too much on. The thing that I would say on the treadmill to hell issue is I agree with what you say, and I think sort of a weird corollary to think about is think about the Bank of Japan, because we're talking about transactions and prices, right? And when you have a market that can to some extent be controlled, usually what you have is prices get controlled and transactions dry up as a result. So I think you're starting to see some signs of that in China in the property market where, they're really doing a lot to discourage people from slashing prices, at least in an overt way. Like, you can see these anecdotes and you see, they're giving away all sorts of free shit. And if you buy a place, and, there's backdoor ways of doing it, but the headline prices have not collapsed.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing that's the biggest risk. And I say compare it to the Bank of Japan, because in a weird way, it's similar, because the Bank of Japan is setting the price of Japanese government bonds, and they're 50 basis points, but people don't really want to transact at that price. So the volumes are drying up, because there's no market there. And I think what you might see in China is a very similar dynamic, where they really don't want to put into place like a self-reinforcing bubble collapse where prices go down, people sell because prices go down, the classic self-reinforcing cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But by supporting prices, you're also going to have not a lot of transactions happening. So that's what the data seems to be supporting so far. It means you don't get, like, people still feel wealthy on paper, but it also means that you're going to struggle to generate the economic activity from building and selling homes that you previously were, because the number of homes, the number of transactions, the square footage of new stuff hitting the market is going to be much less.
Which is kind of what they want. But is there any equivalent in the US where we set the price of something like that? I mean, I know that the Texas Railroad Commission used to basically set the price of oil, like in the 1960s and 70s, based on production quotas and things like that. But can you think of anything in the US economy that is in any way analogous, where the government sets a price for something? I'm also thinking in terms of Biden's State of the Union last week, where he was saying, all federal government projects will be built with things, fiber optic cables and stuff like that built in the United States, which is actually a backhanded way of also setting a minimum price for some of these things, because that's going to cost more, but that's maybe a little bit of a stretch. Can you think of anything in the U.S. economy that's analogous to what you're talking about?
One example, not a current one, would be when gold was still fixed, at $34 an ounce back before 1971, and that was a fake price, and then transactions dried up because no one wanted to transact at that price. And then the market snapped to something that was closer to the real market price. That was a long time ago now, but you do see those dynamics happen.
I guess ethanol is sort of a similar thing to this. It's not as sort of blunt instrument as there's a minimum price for corn, but if you are going to set sort of minimum standards for ethanol in U.S. gasoline, you are basically setting a floor on prices, right? I guess you're not actually saying it's going to be this figure. You're just sort of setting a range, and I guess that's different. But I don't know. I'm just trying to think if there's anything else like that, or if that really is just kind of unique to what China and Japan are trying to do. India obviously does it all the time with them, especially with agricultural goods. Which is I couldn't have planned that segue any better. Just to talk very briefly about the last piece of China news there. This really struck me, and I know there are a lot of I've been speaking to a lot of ag audiences lately, so I think there are more ag listeners on the podcast than before. And I just, maybe I'm making a mountain out of a molehill here, but I just thought it was interesting that China's number one central document for 2023, that its focus is on agriculture. I feel like in the United States and parts of Europe, there have been a lot of clashes between farmers and governments, where farmers, I think rightfully, feel overlooked from a policy perspective, feel like they've been in some ways made a boogeyman by the ESG movement. And the flip side is that here is China coming out and saying that its number one focus is agriculture, and that it needs to deepen import diversification and boost yields and create rural jobs. All of that seems very, very, they're basically, they even said, this line stuck out to me: despite accounting for a small proportion of the national GDP, agriculture is the foundation of modernization. That's from the CCTV. I can't imagine a U.S. president or U.S. media coming out and saying that about farmers. The flip side is, of course, we're much more food secure in the Western world. China is not. China needs to figure out how to grow more crops with less land, and land that has been polluted over time, because they don't have access to the types of technology and land that we do in the rest of the West. But I don't know. I just thought it was really interesting. And the last reason I thought it was interesting was because people make a lot of comparisons between Xi and Mao. I generally reject them. I think that's the wrong way to understand Xi Jinping. But Mao's political career really took a turn for the worse when he authored his own set of rural, quote unquote, reforms in the late 1950s. I mean, you can draw a direct line from the famines that his policies caused to the Cultural Revolution and the Gang of Four and all those other sorts of things. So I just thought it was interesting that China's focusing on that so much. And I would also say, like, you can, there are all these challenges to China realizing those goals, but if they're very serious about ensuring food security and deepening import diversification, if you are selling agricultural products to China, they are telegraphing to you that they don't want to buy from you as soon as possible. So don't ignore the signal.
Yeah, I think there's a few elements to that. The insecurity one, which you pointed out, is definitely a big one, and a historical insecurity one, driving a lot of that desire for independence. But also, I wonder if there's a development aspect to this too, because I think it was in your conversation last week on the podcast, you were talking about sort of the lost, not the lost China, but the other China that no one talks about, the 600 million people who did not make it, into middle income status, who are kind of stuck in more backward and interior parts of the country. In many ways, you have like two development stories in China. And if you look at other Asian success stories, like look at Japan, for instance, there's a really good book called How Asia Works by a guy named Joe Studwell, I think, that tells this story in a very good way. And in Japan, they started with agriculture. Agriculture was one of the big success stories for them. And the way that they got small-scale farmers and really, smallholders to increase their agricultural productivity was not necessarily by, collectivizing everything and putting them on these big farms, but really focusing on like small-scale, labor-intensive productivity improvement. And the story in the book is talking about how that was the sort of initial stepping stone to really increasing productivity in Japan, releasing some surplus capital that then they could use to reinvest, in moving up the value chain. And I only mention that because it's an interesting comparison, because I think China suffers from a lot of the same kind of backwardness and low productivity in a lot of those areas that a much lower developed country typically faces. So they might see an opportunity there. And the other thing is just, thinking about Mao versus Xi Jinping, or Xi Jinping versus any of the other, previous leaders of China. I think one of his self-defining characteristics is the formative time that he spent during the Cultural Revolution, where he was banished to the countryside. And he sort of describes himself as a man of the earth, a man of the people. And I think people refer to this as he has the yellow earth complex, I think is the term that Xi watchers use. But just this notion that like he has some kind of connection with farmers and the real, the real Chinese, the real peasants that other elites don't. And I think there's a focus there for him that maybe there's not for other elite policymakers in China. And that could be a part.
I think I'm not making this up. I'm pretty sure Xi Jinping's first visit to the United States, I think he went to Iowa. I can't remember if he went to Iowa first, but I seem to remember, I probably shouldn't say that without double checking it, but I feel like somewhere along the way, he also related to the U.S. agricultural complex that way as well. Well, before we leave Asia, why don't we do a little bit of the subcontinent? The thing that stuck out to me this week was Pakistan, and this will be a tale of two cities sort of thing. Pakistan came out and said, their energy minister came out and said they are going to quadruple domestic coal fire capacity to reduce power generation costs and are not going to build new gas-fired plants anymore. The quote from this guy was incredible. It was, quote, "We have some of the world's most efficient regasified LNG-based power plants, but we don't have the gas to run them. And so LNG is no longer part of the long-term plan." I've talked about this a couple different times, that one of the byproducts of Europe being able to survive the winter by paying higher prices for LNG is that developing markets like Pakistan were going to get screwed because they can't compete with the Europeans. But even I was kind of taken aback at this idea that we're going to quadruple coal in a world where basically everybody else is going towards ESG and renewables and things like that. And I wonder if that's a good bet. In some sense, like you need for a national economy to work at the macro level, the more you can drive down energy costs, the better. And if Pakistan is thinking, well, nobody's going to use coal for the next decade, so we'll take the coal and maybe we'll be polluted, but at least we'll have a functioning economy. We'll be able to afford these energy imports that we couldn't do this year and had all these brownouts when the temperature was 120 degrees or whatever it was. I just thought that was a really interesting story in the context of renewables and ESG and all that sort of thing. And I don't know whether it's probably not a good thing for Pakistan that they're having to resort to that, but yeah, I don't know the pitfalls of betting on LNG for a developing market when Europe soaks up all that demand right front and center. But I think you had some more optimistic things that you saw in India, right, Rob?
Well, just on the Pakistan before we shift, sitting here in Paris, where environmentalism is a very important thing for people. I think this is an interesting theme that it illustrates because one can say that one of the big flaws in sort of ESG thinking, or at least the way that it's expressed in the French context that I've experienced, is people talk about environmentalism, they talk about, greening the economy in a way that is degrowth, that is, reducing consumption, that is very much like anti-American, we don't like GDP and those concepts. And, the thing that's notable about Pakistan doing this is Pakistan is having an economic crisis right now. They're having, natural disasters, they're having severe blackouts across the country. They're having a macro series of crises. And the takeaway, I think, is there's a flaw in connecting, environmentalism and greening things with the notion that you can do that while going backward on the wealth scale or backward on the growth scale. Because the data shows countries that are poorer treat the environment worse. And, this is an interesting illustration of that. So the more you can get things self-reinforcing in a positive growth direction, the more you're going to see countries like Pakistan not make those decisions. But unfortunately, that's not where we're headed.
Yeah. Well, at least not in the short term. I mean, maybe it can in the long term, but yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult picture, but apparently not. I mean, in India, right next door, has tons of its own problems in terms of energy. And I mean, there's arguably, well, I can't say that it's the most water stressed country in the world. I'm sure we can find some country in a desert that is worse. But when you look at the rate at which India is using up its groundwater, pretty terrible. There's actually an Indian government think tank. One of my favorite slides to put up when I do presentations is an Indian government think tank that thinks that Indian water demand is going to exceed supply by a factor of 2 by 2030. Like when you sort of put that in your brain, it always makes my brain explode. But we were gonna say nice things about India, not bad things about India. So tell me what you saw out of India. I mean, yeah, you lead up to the story, and then maybe I'll add a little bit of geopolitical seasoning on top of it.
Well, I don't have that much to say other than pointing out that there was an interesting piece this week where India has not ordered a new plane for 17 years, a new passenger jet. And this week, they ordered 470 passenger jets, which is the biggest order in the history of the world. And they split it between Airbus and Boeing, by the way. So talk about multipolarity and hedging your bets.
All right.
But that's a pretty big statement.
It is a big statement, and you hit it right on the head. They split it between Boeing and Airbus, so it's a really good nod to multipolarity. I sort of did some hemming and hawing in the sit rep. Was that 2 weeks ago now? About how I thought India was pursuing its non-aligned thing, but maybe just maybe they were moving over a little bit to the United States. I concluded that piece by saying, I really don't think that's what's happening, but I at least need to like raise the possibility. But then you get something like this and you sort of see, India really is kind of hedging its bets all over the place. But it also goes to, it's funny how airlines become national symbols in this way. Like, Emirati and Qatar Airways, all the Qatar Airways ads that we had to watch during the World Cup and stuff like that, versus, the US airlines that are just immeasurably shitty compared to some of these great global airlines. So I don't know, that feels sort of like old 20th century style thinking that you need a national air carrier that everybody's going to like more than the others. Apparently Air India was very nice in the 1950s and 1960s. Did you know this? It was like one of the most modern airlines, and it was renowned for its like service and things like that. And half the reason people hate it now is because they basically haven't updated it since back then. Kind of reminded me of like the New York City subway was at one point in time like revolutionary and one of the greatest public transportation systems in the world, but that was like 100 years ago, and just nobody's actually spent the time upgrading it and making sure it stays, I just said updated. I don't want to say up to date on this, but you know what I'm trying to say, that like, because nobody spent the money on updates, it's now, a cesspool of flooding and rats and God knows what else. So, but I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about national air carriers being these symbols of geopolitical power? That feels so old fashioned to me, but Air India doubling down on this, it actually sort of seems like India is trying to say, oh, like we are a global power. Like we have a nice airline. You can fly the airline without worrying about what's in the seat underneath you.
So I think there's kind of a category of industrial sectors that have a prestige value, or at least signal that you've made it to a certain extent. So airlines is a big one that everyone knows about. And, the thing about airlines is they're extremely difficult. It's just such a hard business because you're dealing with enormously complex, quirky, huge capital equipment on extremely razor thin margins. And not too many people or not too many countries or businesses can do it. No one makes any money. So it's sort of, you're in a unique club to a certain extent if you have one of these. So there's sort of an element where I think a lot of countries feel like they need to have one to show that they can. But it's similar, like autos are a very similar thing. Like you look at which countries actually produce cars, and there really aren't that many. And in a similar vein, like producing a car is kind of the apex of national development, because you're combining extremely complex industrial orchestration of all these different processes and systems and electronics with consumer, know-how and consumer sensitivity to what people actually want to drive and what the car looks like and styling and design. It's an extremely difficult prospect to do it well and not just hemorrhage money. Steel is a similar thing. Like if you look at countries that have reached a certain index level of development, they make their own steel. That's like at the bottom of the list, but that's, if you think of national development like a video game, like steel is, the item that you get earlier in the game, and then you work your way up to cars, and then, maybe you have a successful airline. That's, if you're running like Emirates airline, then man, you've really reached the final levels. But
although apparently in the United States, then we get to cloud champion, and then you lose all of your steel, and then the society collapses in on itself because you forgot how to make everything, right?
Yeah, that's once you beat the game, you just quit.
Yeah, it's funny that those things you never do the downfall of the civilization, right? I guess you kind of lose and you get defeated, but that's about it.
Well, no one has experienced that yet, because since the Industrial Revolution happened, we haven't had a downfall. We've had countries get blown up, like Germany in World War II.
Yeah,
but thankfully we haven't quite experienced the barbarian hordes overrunning, and breaking apart our steel foundries and that sort of thing.
It's very depressing to me that the apex of modern industrial society is making a car. Can you imagine if the apex of modern industrial society was like something more useful or productive or more efficient than a car? I don't know. Maybe I'm showing my biases.
Well, I guess you could say it's a photolithography machine for semiconductors is the new apex.
I guess that's true from an industrial perspective. I guess mRNA vaccines and stuff like that is also like the apex from a different sort of biotechnical perspective. And then the last thing to say before we move on from here, and this doesn't have anything to do with India and Pakistan, Rob, but it looks like the price of lithium and nickel were rolling over this week. You brought that up to me, and I could be like every asshole out there in the podcast space and be like, have we reached peak electric vehicles, or are we now no longer doing electric vehicles and now we don't need lithium and nickel anymore? It sounds like this is probably just like, people wanted to get nickel and lithium because that was the new hot thing, and now there's too much of it. But I don't know. I don't see electric vehicles becoming the apex of modern industrial society either. I just don't think electric vehicles are really going to do it. But why don't I let you riff on that for a second?
No, I think that's right. Electric vehicles are not the apex of society, that's for sure. But on the lithium thing, that's an interesting case because I think a lot of listeners who may not be into the stock market or into like really analyzing companies kind of miss this, because you get pitched these stories about, oh, here's this growth opportunity, this massive secular opportunity and EVs, and here's how you play it. But it's an awfully bumpy road from here to there. So just to put it into context, right now the price of lithium is around $74,000 a ton. And Goldman is predicting that by 2024, it's going to be $11,000 a ton. That's a pretty damn big decline. And it's not because of a lack of demand. It's just because supply, the supply response has been huge. So that's the real tricky thing when you're dealing with these deep cyclicals. And deep cyclical really just means how long does it take to bring new supply on? Because whenever you have anything like lithium takes a long time, especially the lithium pools like you see in Chile and Argentina and Bolivia. That's like a 5 to 7 year process to create one of those and really get it online. So, you have these huge swings in the meantime that shake everyone out. And it's good for EV adoption, but it does make investing tricky unless you have a very long time horizon and a very patient temperament.
Yeah, and which China is apparently betting big on too, aren't they? They're like now the biggest electric vehicle, I guess, producer in the world, or they produced some absurd amount this year. I was also thinking about how, like, the Germans weren't always the best at making cars. Like, I feel like it was the British were good at making cars, and then it was the Germans, and then the Japanese took the baton. It's interesting to see if that baton's going to get dropped or if EVs are just going to replace it, and that's going to open up the market to some other place. I don't know. It does feel like the automotive industry is fundamentally going to change, and it's just hard for me to see that EVs is the path towards future success there. But I don't know. Like, probably people didn't imagine in the 1890s that automobiles were going to assume the position that they did in the modern economy.
Well, I think there's two overlapping issues there with the EVs in China. So China has really emerged as an automaker in the last, they were always a domestic automaker and supplying themselves for longer than this. But really in the last 10 years, they've become a global automaker. And now, like, you can walk down the street anywhere in rural France and you'll see a Chinese-made vehicle. Like, they're coming. And I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I believe that the Chinese brands are expected to take something in the region of, 28% market share in the European market in the next 2 years, which is up from kind of a low double-digit percent now. That's a huge change. Huge. In like, auto share usually changes like 1%, 2% per year. Like, it's a slow moving thing. So we're talking about a tsunami of Chinese made cars entering the European market, for instance, which is testament to the fact that getting back to, cars being the apex of industrial civilization in many ways, or at least industrial capabilities, that China has moved up. They've met that, level of the video game. But it also is testament, getting away from market forces to the fact that China, more than any other country, very, very aggressively supported the development of the EV supply chain and batteries, battery production, everything around that, which was not really a market decision because the Americans didn't do it. The Europeans dragged their feet. Like a lot of these car companies realized like, hey, this is just going to replace a lot of the stuff we already have. And we're not going to make more money from these cars. I mean, this is a huge disruption in the market. But China, the sort of incentives they put into place, the policies they put into place, overcame that lack of market incentive. I don't know if I'm explaining this well, but like, you wouldn't do this if you didn't have to. And China realized that, and they pushed this through, and that gave them a big head start, which has contributed a lot to them taking all this market share.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me. But you sent me a book a while back that was, why don't we have flying cars yet? Do you think we're going to get electric airplanes now at the same time? Is Air India buying a bunch of planes that are going to be obsolete because we're going to have some kind of equivalent in the airplane industry? Or is that just too crazy? I imagine that people don't want to fly in airplanes that run on solar panels or something like that. That would probably make them feel uncomfortable.
Well, I think technologically that's just impossible. So it's very different from the car issue. They do have VTOLs, which are, electrically powered, basically big drones that can fly people around. But those are shorter distance aircraft, and they don't, you're not going to fly over the Atlantic on that. But yeah, no, the alternative energy thing is an interesting one because, there is not much of an economic incentive to do a lot of these things. And when you talk about the difference, getting back to the theme of our earlier discussion about interfering in markets, that was an advantage for China because they were able to overcome the fact that if left to their own devices, most companies, they don't want to build an electric vehicle supply chain. Ford is spending $50 billion to do this thing. Are we going to buy more Ford cars 5 years from now? No, they're just hoping to be able to replace what they already do now. But they have to do it with EVs because that's where things are going and the consumers sort of want them. And there's political pressure to do it. But they're dragging their feet, or at least they were until very recently.
Yep. Meanwhile, I don't think we're going to post the video of this podcast, but listeners, I'm muting and giving my daughter toys to play with so that she doesn't scream as Rob is eloquently talking, and I'm trying to figure out my milk with toast hot takes as we're going here. So, but I think we have to.
Jacob he's struggling here.
But I think we should talk at least about one more thing before we close the podcast with apologies, which is this stuff between Poland and the European Union is not good for the EU perspective. I said in our sort of annual CI forecast that I really think this is the year for Europe to show that the EU is going to be something more than it is, or I'm going to have to get a little bit more skeptical that the EU is ever going to live up to its potential, because I just don't know that you're ever going to get, can you imagine, you're never going to get another Russian invasion of Ukraine and another global pandemic. And if this is not what's going to cause Europe to come together, I don't know what is. Now, the two things that happened this week, the Polish president last week, he was supposed to just rubber stamp a bill that would have unlocked EU recovery funds for Poland. And instead, he decided to be a little nudnik, and he sent it to the Constitutional Tribunal. And I don't think that the Polish government is super happy about that. The Law and Justice Party, I think, wanted that bill to come through, and the president is not technically with that party, and he's a lame duck. So he was just kind of feeling himself and sent it to the Constitutional Tribunal. Maybe it gets approved. Maybe we look back at this as some kind of bureaucratic check that doesn't matter. But I didn't think that was a particularly good sign. And then you also had the European Commission, and I don't know whether this was hurried along by Poland dragging its feet on those two bills, but basically saying that I think this was going to happen anyway. I just don't know if the timing was related to that. But the European Commission is taking Poland to court because Poland said last year Polish law actually supersedes EU law. And that was a big challenge. Now the European Commission is saying, okay, we're going to go to court and let's see what the European Court of Justice says. I'm not a legal expert, European sort of law and things like that. But I think that's going to be a really interesting case. And if the European Court of Justice, as I assume, says, no, EU law is supposed to take paramount status here, I wonder what Poland does, and also I also wonder what flavor of Polish government will be in power around that particular time. But so those are two things that maybe they eventually get resolved. Maybe I shouldn't be making too much out of those bureaucratic hurdles, because you can literally throw a dart on EU bureaucratic legal news and find something that people will say, oh, this is the thing that really changes everything, and then they just come up with some other new law or some other new intricacy. But I don't like the way that the year is really starting off from the EU from that perspective. It doesn't feel like some of these problems between East and West and Germany and France and Italy and Brussels are getting solved in ways that make me feel particularly confident that they're taking advantage of this opportunity that is sitting in front of them.
Yeah, that does seem right. On the Poland case in particular, let me ask, what is their incentive? Because as you've pointed out in the SITREP and other places, there's huge support for the EU within Poland, within the general populace. Are they trying to appeal to their base because it's a right-wing government in Poland right now, and hope that they won't pay the price for it at the ballot box? Is it something else? What is going on here?
Well, I think the chief Polish complaint actually does make sense to me, which is, hey, we want the rules to benefit Eastern European countries just as much as they benefit Germany and France. Germany and France seem to be able to break the rules sometimes, but us in the East, we get you slap us on the wrist for any little thing, and we want national sovereignty and all these other things. But as you said, that's a very difficult needle for the Polish government to thread, because there is such widespread support for the EU in Poland, and they need those recovery funds. The 30 billion or so euros that are supposed to go to Poland as part of the recovery funds, that's a big deal for Poland. I think Italy is the top recipient, but I think Poland was supposed to be the second recipient. And if you're going to build a really vibrant economy in Eastern Europe, it's going to have to be around Poland. There's really no other country that has the scale and the know-how and all the other things that you're going to do. So I think it has something to do with Poland wants to be respected as more of an equal within the European Union, and that's at least some of what that party is. That's at least some of what that party is basically playing for. But you can play it too hard. You can bang that nationalist drum a little bit too much. And that's sort of what's happened. You've got a president there who the party now wanted to move forward with this concession so that they can get access to the funds. And the president is basically saying no. I'm not in the bowels of domestic Polish politics, so I don't know exactly what the president is thinking there. But I think that's what the PIS party is thinking about. They wanted to push back on sovereignty issues and rule of law issues and things like that. And they're just struggling a little bit to get the rest of the European Union and Brussels to take them seriously, while also getting access to all the goodies that you get from EU membership, and which the Polish people want.
In a similar vein, there was some coverage this week on Italy, and supposedly Giorgia Meloni was very annoyed at Macron and at Scholz for excluding her from some events that they were holding in Paris. They had a private dinner, just the two of them, and that was on the channels as well. So sort of a similar dynamic where, Italy has been kind of towing the line a little bit, and they have an enormous dependency, but also this feeling of not being taken seriously, of being a second-tier member, which could pose major problems.
Well, and if the EU is really going to work, this is the challenge for Germany and France. There can't be any second-tier members. Everybody needs to be a first-tier member. And anybody that is a second-tier member, maybe they shouldn't be in the European Union. I mean, that's a very difficult conversation to have. I can say that as an armchair American saying that. But that's really what it means. And in practical terms, that means things like Germany bails out Italian debt if it comes to that. That means digital sovereignty at sort of an EU level rather than at a national level. It means the same deficit rules and state spending rules for everybody across the bloc. And that's just something that the EU, because of the compromises that went into forming it in the first place, really hasn't been able to work out. And that's why I say these crises that the EU is facing right now, this is the opportunity. This is the time that you're going to make change, because if you continue to get held up by bureaucracy and inertia and things like that, absent the aliens actually sending those balloons or something like that, I don't see that we're going to get a bigger crisis than the ones that they've just been given. And I just don't like the initial returns on the capitalization. It feels like they know it's an issue, but the fiddles are still out. There's still a little too much fiddling while Rome is burning. Sorry, Georgia. Well, we've gone 45 minutes, Rob, and this one is cooperating so far. Is there anything else you want to hit on the podcast before we say sayonara?
No, I think we count our blessings that your little one was so good and cut it off. Good way to end it.
Yes, and as I say that, she tosses the top of my water bottle, which did really clutch action here as a podcast extender. Hello. So with that, we'll say goodbye, and I'll make sure that Annie does not join the podcast for next time. Until then, Rob, take care. I'll see you soon.
See you soon.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.